I'm really excited to dive into today's office hours, both to learn all about how we can leverage design to create more inclusive experiences, and also because a core goal of Dreamers and Doers is to amplify you and your journeys. And one of the ways we achieve this is by facilitating game-changing educational events such as this one that give us all the opportunity to up-level together. So before we officially begin, I want to share a bit of background information on our esteemed expert. Sandra is an inclusive design strategist and advisor who has been working with organizations all over the world for many years to help them design for social impact. She is also a devoted evangelist and educator on all topics related to designing for inclusion, equity, and justice as the founder and lead for the Inclusive Design Jam community. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Sandra. We are so excited to learn from your expertise today. We know how valuable your time is, and we're so grateful to you for investing in the D&D Collective in this way.
Awesome. Well, thank you to everyone. Well, first of all, to D&D for giving me the chance to come and talk and workshop this topic with all of you today, and those who may be watching the recording afterwards. So I will start with a little bit of background just to kind of give you a sense of, what sort of lens I'm bringing to this topic of inclusive design. We definitely will break down what the term even means, because there can be many, many definitions, and sometimes people get lost in the jargon. And so really the goal for today is for you all to kind of walk away with a practical understanding of what it means to design experiences for real people that are more inclusive, meaning that people, all sorts of people, just regardless of their identity or their lived experience, it's experiences that they can all benefit from and participate in. And where design comes into the picture, because design can be something that is very broad and is not limited to the world of professional designers. And so to get things started, there's already been an introduction that's been made, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But I did want to mention that my pronouns are she, her. So if any of you also want to update your pronouns or share them in your introduction, feel free to do so. And I wanted to mention that why Sandra by Design is all over the place is that is my alias. And so I've been kind of working on my own for the past 4 years as an independent practitioner to really help organizations around the world to think about how to innovate more responsibly and ethically, and how they can start to bring these kind of principles of inclusion, of equity, and even of justice into the business world. And so that we can try to get to a better kind of future where organizations are bridging both purpose and profit. So if you do want to connect with me after the fact, can definitely have conversations on Circle, or I have my socials up here if you want to connect outside of the community. But I wanted to just share a little bit about my background, because it's something that's going to be pretty pivotal to how I approach the topic today. And the first is that I am bringing a multicultural and international lens to the topic, mostly due to my background and my lived experiences. So I was born in Colombia. I grew up in the US, where I lived for about 20 years, and I've been living now in France, so in Europe, for almost 10 years. And so I'm constantly kind of bringing in multicultural lens to really kind of ensure that the work that we do and that I will talk about today, that it's decentralized and global in nature. So we're not necessarily centering just a North American perspective, which can sometimes happen inadvertently. And then secondly, just my professional background, I spent the majority of my career at Google, where I helped teams to embrace innovation and digital transformation, while at the same time I've been forging this path toward designing for social impact, which is what led me to eventually create my own practice under the name Sandra by Design. And the goal is, again, to really focus on empowering as many people as possible. And that's kind of what I'm doing today with the community, empowering as many people as possible to really actively work towards designing a more just future. I'll talk about the community a little bit later, but just wanted to throw it up on the screen because we do have a place with other practitioners, designers and non-designers alike, who talk about these topics, workshop these topics, and do so in kind of a peer-based volunteer-run community. So we'll touch on this a little bit later, but just wanted to throw that up on the screen in case we don't have time to go through everything today. We'll have a chance to continue the discussion there as well as on Circle. And so what are the 3 key questions or 3 key kind of areas that we're going to cover today? So first is really trying to unpack what it means to design a good experience. And so on that level, it's questioning, what do we mean by design? What do we mean by designer? And what do we mean by good design? So really kind of unpacking that and exploring that a bit further. So if in the chat, if you want to tell me if you consider yourself a designer, that would be really helpful. Just to know if we have people who self-identify as designers in the room, or if we have people who do not identify as designers, but who are just curious or practicing design in their own way. So feel free to put that in the chat, just kind of so I know who you are and what perspective you're bringing in today. The second topic is going from good design towards inclusive design. So really thinking about what does it mean to design for inclusion? What does that look like in practice? And then we'll close with more of a tactical kind of discussion on like what are tips and tricks that I can use to be thinking about designing inclusive experiences, no matter kind of what those experiences look like, whether they're online, they're in person, they're in applications of websites, or just in kind of being in community. So awesome to see from the chat that we have some people here who are working on design from a strategic lens, and someone that runs a tech nonprofit who is thinking about how they're designing their products. So that's great to see the perspectives here, both formally trained designers and not. A couple of things about accessibility that I wanted to focus on, or I wanted to chat about before we move forward, is that if you do benefit from closed captions, you should be able to see those at the bottom of the screen. So you'll just have to click on the menu, the 3 dots, which allow you to turn on the closed captions and even review a live transcript. I will do my best to, especially for those of you who may benefit from a description of what's on the screen, if you happen to be away from your screen, or you may benefit from that, I will make sure to describe any sort of non-decorative images. And we will be using a tool called Slido, which I'll share in the chat in just a second. So if in case you need this, it's compatible with screen readers. You can also navigate through it via your keyboard. So just wanted to put that up in center, or up in front from the start, just to ensure everyone can fully participate and feel included in today's session. So where I wanted to start is with my lens. And I think that if you are a designer, or if you're not a designer, but if you're creating something that another person is going to use, it's really important to not just focus on who you're designing for, but also focusing on yourself as an individual. And we're going to come back to this question a little bit later, but I wanted to put on the screen and be very explicit about the lens that I'm bringing to the conversation today. And I already mentioned the fact that it's multicultural, but I wanted to show you all kind of a way to start thinking about yourself as a creator, as a founder, as a maker, as an entrepreneur, as anyone that's bringing something to life in the world. It's important to recognize what is your starting point, what is your lived experience, what is your identity, knowing that it's very multifaceted, but all of these sorts of parts about yourself and about your life and your lived experience are going to influence what you build and who you build it for. And so it's very important. I would say that this is a really great exercise to do, whether you are part of a team or whether you're working on your own, but to constantly kind of check yourself and say, who am I? And what are the things that I'm bringing to the table, which may cause me to possibly be biased or to exclude or include certain individuals over others. So I'm just putting that on the screen. But I want to hear from you. And this is where we will turn to the Slido, which I'm going to you can access in a variety of ways. So you can either take your phone, which is to me the easiest way. If you take a little screenshot of the QR code, you'll be able to jump right into the this interactive tool, which you'll be able to answer a few questions on. An alternative way is just to click on the link that I just put in the chat, which will open up the tool on your computer. So I will let you choose whatever option works best for you. And then I'm going to have 2 questions that are going to show up on the screen. We'll go through them one by one, just so I get to know you and specifically what you're working at the moment. So first question is just to get a sense of geography. Where do we have representation in the world? Because geographic diversity is something that is kind of one element of diversity to think of when you're designing, or do we have diverse geographic perspectives in our team? So I see we have Providence, and if this is Providence, Rhode Island, I went to college there, so love that city. I grew up in California, so love to see that. Montclair, I don't know. So I don't know where that is, what part of the states that is in, but excited to see LA as well. And this is a good check that the tool is working for everybody. So thank you for answering that first question. But this is really the vital question. So think of one specific thing that you're currently designing or building. And it can be something as broad as I'm working on a new business model, or something as specific as, I'm looking to launch a new feature in products that I'm building. Or perhaps I'm looking to, I'm currently building an agenda for an event that I'm going to run next month. So just kind of think of, what is maybe one specific project or initiative or product or service or whatever it may be, or experience that you're currently working on, currently designing. Describe it in a couple of words, because we're going to come back to this and we're going to do a little bit of a kind of critical exercise to think about who you're truly designing for, who's truly benefiting from this, and what are ways that we can make whatever you're building more inclusive. So I see already we have a response here. You're designing a new homepage for mobile app. So this is really good example to draw from. So kind of there's some interaction design, some user interface design, some user experience design that's happening here. I believe this is from Hannah, creating standard operating procedures for the D&D team. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can try to factor inclusivity into this sort of approach. So thinking of how will these operating procedures affect different members of the community or different members of the team? How will those be communicated? There's lots of different kind of lens of inclusion that can be brought into that. Anybody else? I see we only have 2 submissions. So if anyone else wants to weigh in. So another is systems for consumer brands who care to thrive as they grow. So when you say systems, I'd love to understand, are these, if you want to tell us maybe in the chat, give us a few more details just to clarify what you mean by systems, because that can have a lot of definitions. So someone says it's super vague. But if you want to, perhaps it's still in kind of early exploration phase. So if you don't have a more clear description, it's not a problem, but at least gives us a sense that we have a homepage, so something that's going to be used by end users, operating procedures, something that's going to be used by an internal team, and systems for consumer brands seems to be, it's more kind of a B2B, perhaps, B2B sort of solution, so used by a potential client. So we'll leave those there. Thanks so much for sharing. Keep these in mind as we go through kind of the content that I'm going to put up here on the screen. And so I want to start with the first question, which will be an open-ended question. So you can, we're not going to use Slido for this, but you can feel free to unmute or just tell us in the chat. What comes to mind when you think of the word design? So this will be super open-ended. Would love for this to be any sort of discussion. If you want, you can unmute and tell us, or you can just tell us in the chat. And I'm going to show you a few things. So I will patiently await your responses. Elise?
Yeah, I think the first thing that popped into my mind was sort of anything that other people are interacting with. So like either viewing or otherwise,
Okay.
and in terms of like any element of a thing that people are interacting with.
Okay, so already I'm hearing kind of the notion of like there is some sort of item or something in the world that exists in the world that another person will have an interaction with. Can take many, many forms, but the user seems to be central in that, and some sort of interest, some back and forth between the user and something in the world. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Anyone else want to share? Oh, I see in the chat intentionally creating experiences for people based on a specific problem or objective. Ooh, I like this. So this is more kind of getting into the problem solving and even into human-centered design, which we'll talk a little bit about, but starting with there's some sort of problem in the world, or there's some sort of need that a person has or a problem that they have that we need to address and that we need to come up with a solution for. So I really love these definitions because they are on point and they're very strategic, because a lot of times when people think of design, they think of things like this. They think of furniture, they think of a beautifully designed chair, they may think of fashion. So this is from a Nigerian fashion designer. They may think of a really advanced product, such as an iPhone, or they may think of an experience online. And that's what Hannah says. That's what she thought of. So something that you can use and that is accessible there, and like you both said, Lori and Elise, that there's some sort of interaction between me and the solution. And so I would say that what we can think of, and I think Lori, you captured this in your definition, is that design isn't just limited to physical products or to the environment that we live in, or even to digital interfaces or services. It can actually be expanded much further. And I would argue that designers aren't just those that have gone to design school and that have the official title of UX designer, product designer, interaction designer, fashion designer, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that those are certain types of design. But if we were to think a bit more broadly about what does it mean to design, and it means to be exactly like Lori said, it means to be able to bring something to life that addresses a need or some sort of pain point for a human. And this is where you can think of bringing design into any sort of kind of real world experience that you are imagining or deploying. So an event, a workshop, an experience in a physical place. So really thinking, for instance, of the design of a building, of a meeting room. It's something that you can bring to virtual experiences. So even like what we're doing today, the session today has been designed for interactivity and for inclusivity. So giving you multiple ways to participate. And it's something that you can also bring, if, for instance, you're not a designer on paper, something that you can bring even to what you're producing, for instance, content on social media. So I would say that the definition of design that we're going to use today, and even of experiences, just note that it's going to be very, very broad, and it should apply to pretty much anything that you can be intentional about. And again, designing for real people. And so I want to kind of take then the next level and hear from you. So what does it mean like to design something that, or what does it, how do we know when something is well designed? What is good design? So I'd love to give you a moment to think, what are the things to look for? How does good design feel? How do we know that, as Lori's definition says, that we are actually either solving a specific problem or realizing some sort of objective for real people? What signals to us that, yes. So the fact that it makes sense, it's intuitive, it's not confusing. So it's a really great point to start. So when interacting with the design, it's a seamless experience, it's intuitive. I don't question what I should be doing next. Yes. So there's kind of a sense of fluidity. It's something that is not even always conscious or visible. And I think this is where people get confused with design, because they may think of design as just aesthetics, as something that's beautiful, but it actually goes beyond that. And so to kind of move forward, we usually know when something is well designed because we encounter things that are poorly designed. And it's things that function in ways that contradict our expectations, such as these doors, which you can see are designed in the exact same way, but there actually have to be labels to tell you how to use the doors, and the labels are not the same, meaning that to push and to pull, we're not necessarily getting the same signals as users as to what we need to do with the door. So zero intuitive, zero seamlessness here. We see it as well in terms of complexity. So the fact that a remote control has so many different buttons, we get lost in it. So it really ties to whoever said that, it's something that makes sense, that is seamless. That's not really necessarily what's happening here. The same with any sort of kind of online interface that is so intricate that you can't navigate through it. You don't know where to start, what's the endpoint. It's not necessarily addressing your needs or solving your problems. And kind of in the design world, the heart of, or the kind of primary way to design better solutions is by anchoring those solutions in empathy. And so I'll walk you through an example, and then once I go through this example, I'm going to somewhat contradict myself and explain how empathy is not always enough. And in this visual that you can see here, a lot of times good design is the outcome of, on one hand, understanding people's lived experience, understanding the problems they're facing, understanding their needs, their expectations, their goals, their motivations, their pain points, etc., and using creativity, and in some cases, craft and deeper expertise to create some sort of solution that brings joy, that brings delight, that solves problems. And an example of that, for instance, is so the typical example that you may or may not have heard of, but it's an MRI machine. And as you can see here, this is kind of top-notch technology. This was created by GE Healthcare by a product designer named Doug Dietz. And he had been really, proud on working on the latest model of the MRI machine, cutting-edge technology. And when he found himself actually going to the hospital to observe, how, in this particular instance, how children experience the MRI machine, he realized that he would see children coming out of the hospital room crying. And you could see the parents trying to comfort the child, but it was actually a truly traumatizing experience. So no matter how ergonomically designed the machine was, or how accurate or cutting edge the, all of the machinery that went inside of the machine was, even the quality of the outputs, none of that really replaced the agonizing component of the experience itself. And this was information that the designer could only collect by actually going in person and observing and talking to the families and seeing what the children went through. And what they did with this to try to transform this into a better designed experience, rather than just thinking of what is the best sort of technology that we can create, they actually reimagined, Doug and his team reimagined the experience of going into an MRI machine specifically for children to be an adventure series. So how might we actually make the MRI machine less intimidating by transforming it into something that a child would experience at an amusement park or at a fun party? And so this is where they just took some paint, they put some wallpaper on the walls, they redesigned the entirety of the experience without touching the actual product itself, to be able to create a space for kids to feel more comfortable, more welcoming. And at the core of that was this moment of empathy. So actually going out, talking to real people, observing them in real life, being able to understand, on an emotional level, what the person is going through. And that in turn allows you to design a better experience, right? And this is where things fall a little bit short, because the practice of empathy can actually only get us so far. And this is where we start to see things like exclusion and harm and inequity and discrimination and amplification of stereotypes start to come into the picture. Because if you're truly trying to design more inclusive and more equitable experiences and solutions, a lot of the times we are not asking the right questions, and we're not performing the right checks or holding ourselves accountable in a way to really be able to go beyond the simple practice of empathy. And I'll show you a couple examples of, what does it look like to create something that on paper is a good solution, it's well designed, but it actually ends up creating harm and exclusion. And so our first example is, if you consider yourself going into a room, you may have experiences maybe back in university or in college. You go into the room, all of the desks are designed in a particular way. They're designed with a particular person in mind. And who are they designed for? They're designed for right-handed people. And so as you can see here, the experience of going into this sort of room is already automatically exclusive for someone who is left-handed, because even the environment isn't adapted to and thin people, absolutely. So if we think of, even someone who may be an amputee, someone who may not even fit in the desk because they're designed for a specific default in mind. We're going to come back to this, but this is just kind of example number one. Example number two, if you ever thought about Band-Aids, Band-Aids were designed to match the color of your skin. But if we look at the color schemes or the color palettes that are used for Band-Aids, they are beige. And so this actually only aligns with a certain set of individuals, so people who have lighter skin tones, who are able to use Band-Aids. Eventually we have transparent Band-Aids, but this wasn't something at the origin of the product. So already we're seeing that there are certain kind of defaults that are coming into the picture. We're designing for a specific person who is in our imagination, even if we're trying to resolve for certain pain points or problems. The person tends to kind of step into a specific, they basically have a certain set of identities, which are considered default. We'll come back to that. Another example is creating, for instance, technology. This technology is a camera from way back in the day, so in the 2000s, or 2010s, that was essentially designed to detect individuals who blink. But as we can see here, the sorts of data that was used to train the sensor that detects whether someone is blinking, we can tell that that data was not necessarily calibrated to account for different eye shapes. And so as we see here, and to a certain extent, the technology ends up basically being racist against people who do not have the standard or the default eye shape, which in this case tends to align with people who are Caucasian, who were likely used as the kind of the base data sample for the sensor technology that was used. And we see this actually coming more and more into the picture when we start to think of any sort of solutions that you're building that are tied to algorithms and to machine learning. That machine learning is actually a reflection, or ends up reflecting and amplifying the biases that we have as humans. And as you can see here with this kind of facial recognition engine that was created by Microsoft, as you can see here that they're not able to detect this photo of Michelle Obama as aligning with her actual gender identity. So they pick it up as a young man with a black shirt. Her hair is actually not picked up as actually being her hair. It's picked up as being a hairpiece at 93 or practically 94% confidence level. And so we're seeing again that these algorithms are not necessarily representing the true diversity that exists in the world. They're amplifying potential assumptions or stereotypes that we may hold even subconsciously. And this gets to an extreme level when these sorts of technology or these sorts of solutions that we build are being used to determine who gets access to resources. Such as this example of a healthcare algorithm that was used to determine who would get access to certain complex healthcare programs. And the algorithm was actually found to be racist in the sense that there's already systemic racism in the medical world or in healthcare, in the sense that people who identify as Black, usually their symptoms tend to be underplayed or not necessarily believed. They're not necessarily believed in terms of the severity of their symptoms. And a lot of this kind of bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, tends to get embedded into the type of technology that we built. And once you start to scale that out to hundreds of thousands or millions of people, it ends up creating disparities where a study that was done found that this healthcare algorithm was more likely to refer white people to these complex medical programs compared to Black people. And even when the symptoms were the same or when Black people were experiencing worse symptoms. So we see that there is a problem here that algorithms cannot solve because we're not necessarily starting at the starting point, which is how can we possibly be embedding bias and even potential kind of belief systems of racism into the products and solutions that we build. So this is again a more extreme example. And so this is where we have to kind of reflect back. So why is this happening? Is it something that you may be actually unintentionally building into the solutions that you're building without even noticing? And this is where we have to first start with the fact that no one is immune for bias. So the fact that, our brain is exposed to cognitive bias in the sense that we have to make shortcuts. We're constantly kind of receiving a lot of data from the world. We have to be able to decipher through that data. So there are certain shortcuts that our brain has to make. This is where kind of stereotypes, assumptions, generalizations, they tend to come into the picture. Also, certain types of bias like confirmation bias, where you see a certain piece of information, your brain says, I've seen this information before, you make an assumption. So this could be, for instance, seeing that, the women in the world that maybe you've met tend to like to wear certain type of colors. And so you may make the conclusion that all women like to wear pink. And so if you're part of a marketing team, you might create certain products, perhaps for children, that are all pink, thus reinforcing gender stereotypes. So as you can see, this can come from either implicit bias, or it can come from us just kind of accepting gender norms as something that is normal. And that ends up being baked into what we build if we're not actively questioning it and challenging it. And so this is where we have to kind of zoom out and really understand that we're all kind of operating and living in a world that's regulated by these larger systems, what we call systems of oppression. So the fact that, we are in a world where whiteness is considered superior to other skin colors or other races. We are in a world where that's regulated by what we call the cis heteropatriarchy, which means that certain sort of identities are seen as the default. So being cisgender or being heterosexual, or even being a man in society leads you to have more advantages in society, to have more access to resources, to opportunities, to knowledge. And it's what's kind of shown here through this metaphor of having kind of the keys to this locked door, that being part of certain identity groups, and I'll show you here in this visual where we can kind of start to think of, well, how is power and privilege distributed in society? And we see that there's certain people with certain identities that are more likely to benefit from unearned advantages in society on the basis of their identity, because they are either belonging to a specific social group or they're perceived as belonging to a social group, a specific social group. So for instance, like the examples I mentioned, being a cisgender man, being white, having post-secondary education, being able-bodied, being heterosexual, being slim, like the example with the desks, being right-handed, you could say. But as you can see here, this is, it's important to think a little bit bigger picture about, when you're building something, who is actually using it? And are there particular instances where I may be defaulting to creating solutions that are going to be most beneficial and most accessible to people who are in the middle of this circle? And this is where you have to, we're going to go through this through a few examples, a few exercises. It's really important as you're trying to build, if your goal is to build more inclusive experiences and solutions, you have to be actively and frequently questioning, what's my bias? What are the potential ways that I may be making assumptions about other people, or that I may be projecting my own life experience onto others, even if I'm practicing empathy, because we cannot truly be neutral and objective. We kind of carry, again, remember the lens slide that I showed you? I carry all of my lived experiences with me, and I have to make a lot of intentional efforts to detach from all of that because it's who I am, and I bring that into my work even unconsciously. And then secondly, thinking about what are ways that we can start to redistribute power. So when you are creating solutions for people, how can we actually start to include those people in the process of creating your solution? And it's not just about getting feedback from them, but it's actually about making sure that they have a say, that they have decision-making power, that if they are, for instance, for whoever's creating the mobile app, the homepage of the mobile app, if you're doing any sort of user testing, how can you get individuals to actually be part of defining the requirements for your app? How, can you start to rethink the design so it's not just designing for people, but designing with people? And also rethinking, when we say people, who do we really mean? And that's going to be our first exercise, which is going to be a solo exercise. So what I want you to do is to, if you have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you, or if you have a notepad, maybe on your computer or on your phone, it would just be really helpful to have something where you can just jot a few notes down. And so what we're going to do for this first exercise is we're going to start to look at you. So you as an individual. So you're going to point that mirror to yourself. So instead of thinking, who am I designing for? Who's going to be using or accessing my solution? Think of, who am I? Who am I as a person? And we are going to go back to this wheel of power and privilege. And I want you to write down, again, these are some examples of kind of different identity dimensions that you can think of. There are many more than this. So for instance, age is something that's not factored in here. You can also think of even personality. There are other ways to be able to categorize people into kind of different social buckets, but you can choose to just look at the ones here on the screen and just kind of write down, what are the ways that I self-identify, and where do I live in the world in terms of my privilege and my power in society? Do I find myself living more in the center of the circle, or am I also part of maybe the middle or the outer rings of the circle? And this is something that is not always a very comfortable thing to do, but it's a really good step to recognize, what is my privilege? What also are the potential barriers that I face in the world? And then how can I start to maybe build connections with the people that I'm designing for, so that I don't only design for people who look like me, or for people who represent the default or the majority. Again, the people who are likely to be in the middle. So I want you, if you can just give me kind of a signal, if you've had the chance, if you want to maybe do a thumbs up or just say something in the chat to let me know if you've had the chance to do this first exercise, to really start to think of, who am I? And to gauge, am I more in the middle? Do I have kind of a balance or a mix of advantages and disadvantages, or do I find myself actually on the outer edges? And what does that mean for me when I'm as a creator? So I'll let people give a signal when you're done thinking through this, writing. You don't have to go through every single identity on here. Maybe mark down the ones at least done. Okay. Just mark down the ones that really stand out for you the most. I would say I'm really focusing on gender, race and ethnicity / skin color, which is represented here. Thinking of socioeconomic status, Hannah's done, awesome. I think thinking of level of ability, thinking of sexuality and gender. I said gender already, sexuality. I would say those are kind of the core ones, but it seems like most people are done. Fantastic. So now I want you to go back. So let me just go back to this. So go back to what you're designing. You don't actually have to answer anything in the Slido. I'm just putting it up here on the screen just so you remember what you wrote. So think to the solution that you're designing for, or think of the solution that you're currently working on. And now for this next exercise, I want you to think about, who are you targeting? And you can think again of this kind of wheel that I just showed you. So a lot of the times when we say who we're targeting, we're not necessarily thinking of these dimensions of identity. We're usually thinking, I'm designing for, I don't know, if maybe for the Dreamers and Doers operating procedures, I'm designing for the members of my team who do happen to represent certain identities. Maybe I'm designing for the members of the collective. But I want you to kind of write down in your own words, like, who are you designing for? How do you define these individuals? And a lot of the times, as we can see here, we tend to think of our target users as either the majority, so the majority of people who are going to be using what I'm building, or the average person, or the default person. So I just want you to write that down. If you want to add any sort of layers of identity to that, you can. If you want to define it, like for instance, I'm designing for female entrepreneurs who are raising, their first round of funding. You can do it that way where there might be identity thrown in or maybe not. So write that down for you. Give me a signal kind of when you're done, and we're going to go to that next question. And note that this may not apply to all the sorts of solutions that you're creating. So we are painting kind of broad strokes here, but just to kind of think big picture, who are these people? And then when you're done, we're going to go to the next one, but give me a signal when you've had a chance to write down what's my target audience. Done. Okay, fantastic. All right, so for this next question, now I want you to think, so who is truly benefiting from my solution? And so I have native speakers that showed up here on the left. You can ignore that because that should come afterwards. But just think of, so in practice, who is actually going to use, or maybe think of past similar solutions that you've built in the past, who is actually benefiting the most from what you're building? And this is where we can start to bring in these layers of identity. Is it individuals who tend to speak a certain language? Is it people who tend to be part of certain, who tend to have certain demographics in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of race? Is it people who live in certain parts of the world? Is it people who have certain sorts of professions, who earn certain levels of money? But really try to kind of make it much more concrete. So who actually is getting the most value out of your solution? And again, if you don't know this, it's okay, because sometimes we don't know who's actually, if you're making something that's very scalable, you don't know who's actually using it. But just think about kind of in broad terms, who are these individuals? And I want you to start to think of, for the people who are actually benefiting the most from my solution, do they tend to fall into these groups? So people who are white, people who are cisgender, people who are male or identify as straight or heterosexual, people who are able-bodied, people who are maybe situated in the global north, people who are native speakers of the language that I'm kind of creating my solution in, people who have high socioeconomic status. So really start to think of, are we potentially centering or privileging certain types of users? Do we see those people perhaps overrepresented in those who are using our solutions? So as you kind of start to think through that, I want you to then ask yourself the opposite question. Who is potentially being excluded or harmed? And this is where we start to think of, well, a lot of the times when we design for people, there are people who end up being on the margins. So people who are, well, they only represent 3% of the people using my solution. Or, I'm building a workshop and I didn't think to put closed captions because nobody who is hard of hearing will be attending my event. So there's no need to do that. So I just want you to think of, when we start to look at the people who are on the outer edges of the wheel of power and privilege that I showed you, this is where we start to think of, well, have I ever thought about designing for people who may be unemployed, people who may be foreigners or are undocumented, people who identify as people of color, people who may have a disability? My really intentionally designing for people who may be LGBTQ, who may not identify within the gender binary, who may not use she, her, or he, him pronouns, people who may have different levels of literacy or even digital literacy. Are we thinking of people who may not be native speakers, who may not understand the sorts of language or jargon that I'm using in my operating procedures, for instance? Am I thinking about how people in the global south and maybe the examples that I'm putting into the content that I'm creating, or maybe, the sorts of visuals, the sorts of imagery that I use, is it actually representative of people who fall outside of the quote unquote norm or the default? Again, those people that end up being kind of in the middle of the circle. And this is a really good just kind of thought exercise to be much more explicit of, like, are these people that I have ever thought about? Like, have I ever thought about how a neurodivergent person may use? So for instance, someone who is autistic, someone who has ADHD, someone who has dyslexia. Have I ever thought about how they would use my solution? Can they even use it? Can they access it? And this is really where it starts, where we start to think and start to question and challenge, who is the default user? And how can we actually start to, as we see here, designing for inclusion means how can we start to intentionally design for people who are on the margins, so that we don't start with just designing for the majority or for the default or for the average person who tends to be people who have a lot of privilege already. How can we actually be much more intentional about looking at, well, these people who face the most barriers, who are at the most disadvantage, how can we start to think about them and to center their needs? And an example of this is, if we go back to the Band-Aids, so there are a couple of brands who they actually created their own line of Band-Aids of many different shades. And as we can see here, in terms of the impact that that has, this is something from Twitter from a few years back. So Dominique Apollon, who mentions that it's taken me 45 years around the sun, but for the first time in my life, I know what it feels like to have a Band-Aid in my own skin tone. You can barely even spot it in the first image. For real, I'm holding back tears. And there's something about being able to design for people who have been historically and systemically excluded or overlooked or minimized or basically forgotten. And in the sense that, if we start to actually intentionally take their experiences and their needs into account, we can start to move towards not just reducing harm, but designing for joy, designing for empowerment. As we can see here, this was you could say is a very emotional experience to actually feel seen, to feel like, hey, I have a product that's made for me. I am acknowledged as a human being and not overlooked. And this is where inclusive design kind of comes into the picture. And it's really kind of being able to bring in diverse perspectives, being able to anchor any sort of kind of solution that you're building in the principles of equity and inclusion, really being able to check for bias, to really understand kind of power and how it shows up in your design process, and to think about ethics so that you can get to designing experiences and solutions that are going to be accessible and usable by everyone. So not just by those people in the middle of the circle who we consider our default users, but everyone. And that we start to get rid of language like extreme cases or extreme users and edge cases. And this is where I've translated that kind of into the key principles of inclusive design, where we do start by centering kind of the needs and voices of marginalized communities. We account for intersectional identity, so I'll explain what that is in just a second. All the things that I mentioned, you start to unpack bias, power, and privilege. You start to think about ways before you build something, or as you're building it, you start to already imagine what are the ways that that can create harm, that can create exclusion, that can maybe increase the divides that we have in society, so that you can start to anticipate that and preempt it by designing against it as early as possible. And then skipping ahead to number 6 is really focusing not just on your intentions. So a lot of times you say, well, I did intend for my solution to be exclusive, or for instance, a neurodivergent person to not be able to navigate the homepage of my app. It wasn't my intention. And I think in this sort of process, the goal is to move beyond intentions and to really start to take responsibility and accountability for your impact. So just say, hey, acknowledge the fact that this thing was inexclusive. We perhaps made a deliberate decision because we lack time or we didn't have the resources to design for neurodivergent people. But I'm acknowledging that, and we're on an ongoing journey to do better next time, and to maybe bring someone who's neurodivergent to come in and talk to us about their experience and to give us inputs on what we can do better. So that's just kind of a concrete example of moving from designing for people to designing with marginalized communities. And so another example here, thanks Anna for calling that out. So an example here again is getting rid of, like I just mentioned, getting rid of extreme users, really focusing kind of, okay, so what are the sorts of people that I can start to think more deliberately about when I'm designing? So some examples are here in the middle. And I think it's just really important. And I know we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly through this so we won't have too much time for the second exercise unless you all can stay for maybe 5 extra minutes. But I do want to make a note on the fact that it's not just about designing for people who are in these individual groups, because that is kind of a very simplistic way of thinking of inclusion, when in fact, we know that we are all very diverse individuals. We have multiple layers to our identity. And this is where we start to get into this concept of intersectionality. So how do you actually account for intersectional identities? And this is when you're designing for people, you have to recognize that people based on their different identities, which intersect and interlock, they're all going to have unique experiences of discrimination and of privilege. This is something that comes from Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a critical race theory scholar, a law scholar as well. And I'll show you kind of a concrete example that if you're really thinking of creating, for instance, this new homepage for the app that someone's designing today, how can I make that accessible for disabled people? And so you may think, okay, so I'm going to go and interview disabled people. I want to kind of understand what their experiences are, make sure that I'm following accessibility guidelines so people can fully benefit from this new redesigned homepage. And this is where we have to not only think of disabled people as one singular group, but actually recognize that, first of all, with disability, there are different types of disabilities. And so already right off the bat, when you're designing for inclusion and you're thinking of inclusion for disability inclusion, you have to take into account that the lived experiences of people with different types of disabilities will be very, very different. Their needs and their pain points will not be the same. So you can't kind of make blanket assumptions about people who are part of this group. And secondly, once we start to factor in other layers of identity, we see that, for instance, a Black Eritrean woman who is blind and deaf will be navigating the world in a very different way than a 58-year-old white man with Crohn's disease, and et cetera. You know, the woman who's half Filipino, half white, who's in a wheelchair, you know, when you're thinking of, for instance, creating an inclusive environment, an accessible environment, physical space. So this is something to take into account is that we're not designing just for individual groups that are separate, but the goal is really to bring together people who represent perspectives that cut across multiple groups. So instead of thinking I'm going to go and interview a disabled person, I'm going to be intentional and say, I want to understand how a disabled person who is Black and queer navigates the world so that I design my solution to be anti-racist and to be anti-homophobic and to be accessible for someone with a specific type of disability. And that's where we start to kind of really think of inclusion to go to that next level, to factor in intersectionality. And so I know we only have about a minute left, and perhaps this will be kind of a takeaway exercise. I wanted us to do this together, but we won't have too much time. But the goal would be to really think of this in practice. And I wanted to kind of bring back the principles, like keep these principles in mind as you're building. And I wanted us to think of, you know, how might we design a virtual happy hour for dreamers and doers that is inclusive and that is equitable. And there are many aspects of designing a happy hour. So we have to think of, you know, the invitation, the communication that we use, how we welcome people into this virtual space, the types of activities we do, the content we show, the logistics, so all the behind the scenes stuff, and then how people exit or leave the space and what we do as follow-up. And so we won't have time to do this, unfortunately, but the goal was to kind of take one aspect of this experience that we're going to intentionally design to be more inclusive. And the idea is that we're not going to design an event that perhaps is going to be the same for everyone. Like maybe we're going to pay special attention to creating parts of the event that are going to be specific to people's unique kind of experiences. So for instance, if I design an event for you know, the female entrepreneurship experience, maybe I will have a breakout room that's for people who identify as people of color, because perhaps there are specific conversations that need to happen in that community. And that's kind of where we get to this idea of when you design an inclusive experience, you can actually bring in the lens of equity into that experience, where we take into account the kind of unique situation and the unique life experience that someone has. So rather than giving everyone the same thing, so it's not about designing an equal or universal experience, but rather something that can adapt to the needs of each individual, or at least of the group, the social group that they inhabit. And this is where you see the example here of we're not going to give the same bike to the person in the wheelchair, the tall man, and the small child, because they cannot all equally access and use that solution. So this is where we won't be doing this today, but just kind of take this as a takeaway for you. You know, when you're designing your next experience, I would challenge you to think of, let me pick perhaps a group that is intersectional. Maybe I'm going to focus on someone who maybe is in the outer rings of the circle, the wheel of power. And I'm going to, in my next kind of ideation session, I'm going to think of, how might I make a particular part of the experience or the solution that I'm building more inclusive and equitable for this specific group of people. And the only way to really be able to answer this question is that you have to be in contact with those people. You have to bring them into the discussion. You have to bring them in as co-creators, because you can't design for someone else's experience that you haven't lived yourself. And this is kind of going back again to the limits of empathy, that really how we're going to get to more inclusive and equitable experiences and solutions is by actually creating with the people who have been most overlooked and most excluded in the design process over history. So we didn't get a chance to do that today, but kind of hopefully you can see the practical application of this exercise to whatever you're building today. You have kind of a few keys to take with you. And so just to close in the next couple of minutes, I wanted to leave you with just a few very practical tips and tricks of what can you do, maybe if you're designing a sort of virtual experience or in-person experience, or even if you're thinking of how can I be more inclusive with my coworkers or with my collaborators. And so a couple of things is really thinking of how you invite people to any sort of meeting or workspace or event, workshop, physical environment. And it's really thinking of from the very beginning, how can I ensure that people feel included, that they feel welcome? And I think it's about, instead of opening up invitations to everyone, actually being very intentional about reaching out individually and one-on-one to individuals, and especially to those who have been historically overlooked and marginalized. And I think this is a great way to actually bring people into co-creation. So if it's, for instance, a workshop that you're going to be running next week, how can I ensure that the people who are traditionally, who may have been traditionally excluded in the past, how can I ensure that they have a say even ahead of the event? So that's kind of one example. This one is very, this is something that's on a day-to-day basis, but really thinking of how can I be much more inclusive when it comes to pronouncing names. And a lot of the times it's a question of asking the person, can you tell me how to pronounce your name? Having that person repeat that back to you, and even being okay with asking them multiple times. Because I think a lot of times this is something that we may take for granted for people who are non-native speakers of, whatever language we're speaking, or people who may be foreigners who may not feel comfortable correcting someone. And so I think this is something that's very basic, just making sure whether you're doing user research, whether you're running an event, whether you're meeting with someone for networking, this is just one very practical way to make people feel a sense of belonging and to make them feel respected and valued. Another thing to think about is just language as a whole. And I think we have to be cautious of language that can reinforce the gender binary. So even using terms like, hey guys, or, is your boyfriend or your husband coming to the event? That sort of terminology can be not very inclusive to people who don't identify as either male or female, or who may identify as someone that's not heterosexual. And so by widening kind of the sorts of terms that we use, making them a lot broader, we can again create a space that's more inclusive. At the same time, kind of getting rid of any sort of language that makes assumptions like we all know that. Even using terms like, as you can see here, already we're alluding to sight. And so for someone who may be visually impaired or who may be blind, this sort of language may not necessarily make them feel 100% comfortable. And of course, your mileage may vary. Every person's experience is individual, it's subjective, it's unique. I'm not trying to kind of make broad generalizations, especially as someone who doesn't identify or doesn't have a disability. But again, it's just kind of being cautious of, what sorts of biases or how may my privilege actually be coming through the words that I use. And this includes really thinking about any sort of jargon or complex language that you're using, especially in interfaces that you're building or documents or content that you're creating. And then a couple of final kind of considerations is really thinking about accessibility and thinking about accessibility along. There are many, many kind of best practices and guidelines that exist. But a couple of things that you can think of is, how can I ask ahead of time if you're creating any sort of interaction with people who may benefit from accommodations for accessibility, like we had earlier today in the session, thinking of, have I asked people, have I given them an opportunity to share those ahead of time? Am I thinking about closed captions, about live transcript? Do we need an interpreter for sign language? Am I thinking about the sorts of visuals that I'm using? Am I thinking about color contrast, font size? Like there's a lot of kind of very small tangible things. And I'm happy to chat more about this because there are an array of best practices that you can follow on this. But just kind of, again, tactical way to think about inclusion, but really for instance, people with disabilities. So we're going to end here. I just want to hear from you if there's maybe one action that you want to take following this session. Is there something that you are telling yourself, like, what, this sounds like something that could be useful, that maybe I could bring to other people that I'm working with? Maybe there's something about your follow-up meetings with someone that you may want to experiment, maybe thinking about how do I invite people to an upcoming event, how I might want to think of my communication style. Are there ways that maybe I can bring in more people from marginalized groups to perhaps the design of whatever solution you're building today? Are there ways that maybe I can start to check for bias? What are some of the questions that I can ask myself? What sort of perspectives do I need in my team or in my group of collaborators to be able to identify bias? Can I do this on my own? Perhaps you can. So yeah, I would love to hear from you. Like, what is kind of the one thing that you would like to put into action, perhaps in the next couple of weeks? So we see a couple here to create for those who may be on the margins, not on the majority. Not assuming people fall into certain categories. Yes, based on what I can visually see. And I think this is a really good point, that a lot of the times we tend to group people, whether that's based on any sort of kind of like physical characteristics, whether it's like your voice, your appearance, the way you dress, anything that you may share about yourself. And I think it's important to really recognize that self-identification is really what's most important, like giving people the opportunity to choose how they want to identify and communicate that to the world, rather than just inferring it from their appearance. So I think that's a really great, a great comment here. Anything else? I see someone's typing, so I'll give you a second to finish your thought, or if you don't have the thought ready to share, that's okay too. I may just move forward. I'll wait for the person because I want to be respectful and give you a chance. But gut checking anything I'm creating. Yes. So very happy to send kind of a list of questions that you all can ask yourselves as a follow-up, just so it's kind of a good gut check. And just to kind of leave you with the key takeaways, first and foremost, most important is this self-reflection exercise. So perhaps bringing the wheel of power and privilege to your team, having a conversation about it, identifying what are my gaps in knowledge, what are ways that I can better understand the lived experiences of marginalized groups, how can I start to build relationships with people who are different from myself, who may have different sort of advantages, or I should say privileges and barriers that they face in life. I think second is to start to really take a look at your work. So really reflect on, what are ways that I've maybe built in some assumptions into who I'm serving, into who I'm designing for, into who actually gives me feedback, who actually tests my solution. What are ways that I can start to diversify those perspectives and make sure that I'm not centering only the people with kind of the most power and privilege. And then lastly is to do some experimentation. So I think it's all about really thinking of what are incremental changes that I can make. I have a couple of examples here on the slide, which I can happy to share as follow-up, but really thinking of what are ways that I can rethink how I do research, who the types of people who have a say in whatever I build, the types of people who create with me rather than, being created for. and figuring out how can I start to identify these patterns of bias and exclusion. And a lot of that means that you have to open yourself up to other perspectives, because a lot of time you actually can't do this work on your own. To close, if you do want to continue kind of your learning journey on this, I have a couple of resources that I'm happy to share. I will put them in the chat. But basically, I do have kind of a reading list. So if you do want to read more up on this, you want to dive deeper into the topic, I put together just an article with my favorite resources. So books, articles, videos, podcasts, just things that can kind of help to stimulate your thinking around this topic. And then I also write a newsletter on this. So if anybody wants to get kind of, more tips and tricks, more insights, more concrete examples, I share those regularly in a bi-weekly newsletter. And then, of course, you're welcome to join us in the community where we talk about these topics. We do workshopping, we share best practices, we analyze case studies. We actually have a community meetup next week if anybody wants to join us. But it's a really great place to connect with other people who care about this and who want to learn from each other. And then, of course, if you want to, I left my email address on there, but no problem. If you do want to connect with me afterwards, we can, of course, chat in Circle, or we can just connect on LinkedIn. That would be probably the best place to connect. And that's it. So thank you for staying late. I appreciate those who gave an extra 10 minutes. And turn it over to you, Anna.
This was so good. This was amazing. Thank you so much, Sandra, for sharing your knowledge with us. This was so powerful, definitely emotionally impactful. I feel like I have so many notes and things that I'm walking away with. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining and for participating and being open and willing to learn together.